Good morning, guys. Great to be with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here. As you look at this, there's been so much debate about, these social media companies, the impact they're having on all of us, really, young people specifically. Where do you see the Supreme Court's role in this?
So, this is a really interesting situation. Every time you bring up something connected with the First Amendment and free speech, of course, it gets a lot of emotions going. So, what I always try to do when I know it's an emotional issue is I go right back to the Constitution. And if we remember the First Amendment of the Constitution, it does protect free speech. But what this First Amendment is doing is mainly talking about, well, basically is talking about those political actors, federal, state, and local government actors. So there is a very strong argument that those social media platforms can make that they are not they're not any kind of government actor. They're a private entity, and private media companies have been allowed to regulate what they're putting on their platforms. Now, the sort of intricate legal argument I'm thinking about that one side or another could make here is, well, okay, all that's good and well. Yeah, that was a way long ago, that First Amendment. There have been so many different ways that the First Amendment has been used and abused over the 200 years or so or more that we have been a nation. The one thing we could look at is, let's say a social media platform was restricting a certain entity's political free speech or free speech, but not doing the same to another. Then you can kind of get into, in my legal opinion, but double check me on this because I'm not practicing First Amendment law. But I would say they could look at it in discrimination laws. Are you saying, okay, this kind of XYZ entity can post on our platform, but over here A, B, and C can't? And are those reasons for why you're restricting one over the other truly discriminatory? So then we get away from the First Amendment when we're talking about discrimination laws. But this is an interesting situation because the First Amendment really does not allow federal, state, or local government actors to restrict free speech. The only time the First Amendment could protect some of these is if it leads to imminent lawless action. So that is what would need to be proved in order to restrict that free speech.
Yeah, constitutional experts will often describe free speech being violated when you yell fire in a movie theater because it puts people in danger. Is that what's happening on social media? Are they yelling fire in a movie theater?
Well, it is kind of that way. And the other piece of this, when they compare it to, they make the argument that these social platforms are more like telephones or telegraphs. They're not really, newspapers or radio stations or TV stations. They're not media figures. That actually is an interesting argument that I think they should push, if that side should push, if that's what they're going for, because really the social platforms have no real control. Now, I know the platforms are saying they do. They're saying they remove posts all the time. Well, what are your reasons for removing the posts? I mean, that's something that I would want to dig into more. But when it's something like a WJR, you guys go on the air, you share your opinion, but guess what? You also kind of have to answer to your bosses. You can say almost anything you want, but you know that if you said something that was pornographic or something that was trying to rally your listeners to violence, you're probably going to get fired, and they'd have a good reason to fire you. So there's some control because there's a chain of command or a management structure in place. Now, with Facebook, X, whatever these platforms are calling themselves these days, there's not really that chain of control for the individual publisher, you and I, or anybody out there who might publish on that platform. We're not an employee of that platform. We're a free user of it, and they can't necessarily control it. So there's a logical argument that they could take that post down if they see that threat of imminent violence or other of those really bad things that aren't protected. And we've seen case law that has not allowed them to be protective. Yeah. So there are going to be some very creative legal arguments, Tom and Kevin.
Listen, I understand the violence issue. I understand the profanity thing as well. I get that. But when it comes to free speech, this argument out there that somehow private companies are not supposed to be, beholden to the First Amendment seems tricky to me, because constitutional rights are rights to all Americans, right? So these equal rights apply to a person walking into a private business like a restaurant. The owner can't discriminate by violating a customer's rights under the Constitution, can they? Because we see all these cases all the time. But why is free speech somehow only applicable to a state actor and not a private company? What's the difference in, say, you can't discriminate against someone's race when they walk into a restaurant?
Yeah, so that's a question for the framers when we meet them, in the beyond years. Here's the thing. I don't know that the framers could have imagined that private enterprises would become so powerful and so prolific. So they were always worried about what government actors could do to people. Because remember, we left England because they were, beating down on the original settlers, and they wanted to get away from that tyranny. So if you really put it in that context, that's why so much of the First Amendment, at least, is about government actors. So the kinds of activity you're talking about take us into discrimination laws, federal discrimination laws, where you are protected and you cannot discriminate against someone based on a specific class. So there are going to be some varying arguments here. Not everyone can pin it on the First Amendment. Some of these lawyers are going to bring in some of those other laws that an entity could be violating if they restrict this kind of stuff. That's what I'm kind of getting at. If it looks like a Facebook, for example, is taking down all of Tom Jordan's posts, but none of Kevin Dietz's, and they can't tell you why, Tom's have to go. And then
people know why.
Then we're getting into discrimination.
See, Roshini, but that's what's happening. I'm not talking about violence. I'm not talking about threats or pornographic language. I'm talking about someone's maybe political persuasion, and somehow, and we know that's been happening. And so that's where I get confused as to why somehow that's okay.
That is the best argument. That is the best argument then that the social platforms will have to try to combat this. And also, like if we flip it, the states need to say, well, what is your reasoning? And that's why you see some language of they take them down, but then they don't tell you why they're taking it down.
Right.
And so there's going to be $100,000 fine. Well, I think that could be a little overhyped, that fine. But that is where the crux is going to go. It's like, why some and not the others? Yeah. But it's less about the First Amendment than I think some want us to believe.
Okay. All right. Appreciate it very much. Roshini Rajkumar, political strategist, host of the Crisis Files podcast. Roshini, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.